Jack Daniel's is an American whiskey brand from Tennessee, founded by Jasper Newton Jack Daniel in the late 19th century. As a teenager, he learned distilling from Dan Call and his master distiller Nathan Nearest Green, an enslaved African-American man from Maryland. Green developed a unique charcoal mellowing process that made his whiskey stand out among 60 nearby distilleries. After slavery was abolished, Daniel invited Green to help start his own company. Evidence of Green as Jack Daniel's first head distiller was confirmed in 1972, and the company officially acknowledged his role in 2016. Today, Green's descendants work at the distillery, and the brand honors his legacy in tours, highlighting that Daniel paid black and white workers equally for the same work. JPMorgan Chase, the largest bank in the US, traces some of its history to its predecessors, Citizens Bank and Canal Bank, which were later absorbed into its structure. In the 1800s, these banks routinely accepted enslaved people as collateral, meaning slaveholders used human lives as security for loans. If plantation owners failed to repay, the banks seized ownership of those enslaved individuals. The banks also directly funded plantations that relied on slave labor. Between 1831 and the Civil War, around 13,000 enslaved people were used this way, and the banks ultimately took possession of over 1,000. In 2005, JPMorgan Chase became the first major financial company to publicly acknowledge its direct ties to slavery, issuing an apology and admitting the profits gained through the system. The company also pledged $5 million in scholarships, but many have viewed this as insufficient. Other American banks like Bank of America or Citibank have a similar history. Brooks Brothers, founded in 1818 and the oldest American apparel brand still in operation, was directly tied to the slave economy. In the pre-Civil War era, the company supplied clothing for enslaved people, with slave owners purchasing garments for both daily labor and for presentation at auction houses. Brooks Brothers provided top-of-the-line slave clothing. That's how they called it, distinguishing it from cheaper alternatives used by traders. The brand also profited from the Southern cotton trade, as its clothing relied on slave-produced cotton. While the brand also catered to wealthy clients and became known for dressing Abraham Lincoln, who wore a Brooks Brothers coat the night he was shot, its role in outfitting enslaved people remains a part of its early history. Brooks Brothers has not fully acknowledged these ties to slavery. Domino Sugar traces its origins to Havemeyer, Townsend & Co. refinery, which in 1859 processed sugar produced by enslaved labor in Louisiana and the Caribbean. In 1882, the refinery was rebuilt as the nation's largest, and under Henry O. Havemeyer, it reorganized in 1891 into the American Sugar Refining Company, a near monopoly that soon controlled most US refining. In 1901, Domino was introduced as the flagship consumer brand. Today, Domino Sugar is owned by the Fanjul brothers, whose plantations and related companies have faced repeated criticism for abusive working conditions described as modern slavery. In 2022, US Customs blocked sugar imports from Centro Romana Corporation, a Fanjul-linked company in the Dominican Republic, citing forced labor indicators, but the company denied the allegations. Nike's slavery controversy comes from decades of criticism over sweatshop conditions, child labor, and modern forced labor in its supply chain. Starting in the 1970s, Nike outsourced production to factories in Korea and Taiwan, prioritizing low costs over labor standards. Reports through the 90s exposed workers facing long hours, poverty wages, unsafe conditions, and harassment, with a 1996 Life magazine feature showing Pakistani children stitching Nike soccer balls, drawing worldwide outrage. In Vietnam, one Nike contracted factory exposed workers to toxic chemicals, while factories in other countries reported harassment and intimidation. Despite adopting a code of conduct and releasing transparency reports, critics argue Nike hasn't done enough. More recently, Nike has been tied to allegations of forced labor in China's Uyghur region. A 2020 report identified Nike supplier Qingdao Taekwang employing hundreds of transferred Uyghur workers. Though Nike claimed it ended sourcing from Xinjiang and no Uyghur workers remain at the factory, human rights groups continue to press the company for greater transparency. The Ivory Coast cocoa controversy. In 2021, 8 men from Mali, who said they were forced to work on cocoa plantations in Ivory Coast, filed a lawsuit against major chocolate companies, including Nestlé, Cargill, Mars, Hershey, and Mondelez. They accused the companies of knowingly profiting from child slavery in their supply chains. The case also highlighted the 2001 Harkin-Engel Protocol, where chocolate companies pledged to phase out the worst forms of child labor but were accused of misleading the public. Ivory Coast produces about 45% of the world's cocoa, and the industry has long been tied to child labor and mistreatment. The plaintiffs described being lured with false promises of paid jobs, then forced to work under threats of starvation in horrid conditions. In July 2025, a US appeals court dismissed the case, ruling the plaintiffs had not shown a direct link between their forced labor and the specific farms supplying cocoa to the companies, even though the accused companies collectively buy around 70% of Ivory Coast's cocoa. Yale University, one of the oldest and most prestigious schools in the US, carries deep ties to slavery. Elihu Yale, for whom the university was named in 1845, built his fortune as a governor and president of the East India Company, which was directly involved in the slave trade. Many of Yale's early founders and later leaders owned slaves, and enslaved labor contributed to the construction of buildings like Connecticut Hall, as well as the wealth of Yale's benefactors. In 2017, after years of criticism, Yale renamed Calhoun College, originally honoring pro-slavery politician John C. Calhoun, to Hopper College. In 2020, the Yale and Slavery Research Project under historian David Blight launched, documenting over 200 enslaved people connected to the university. In February 2024, Yale issued a formal apology acknowledging its role in slavery. Tiffany Company, the American luxury jewelry house, founded in New York in 1837 by Charles Tiffany and John B. Young, was built on profits tied to slavery. The company's seed money came from Charles Tiffany's father, who financed the store with money earned from a Connecticut cotton mill. The mill relied on cotton grown in the South by enslaved labor. By 1853, Charles Tiffany took full control and shifted the focus to jewelry, but the company's foundation and early growth were directly connected to the cotton trade. Lehman Brothers was an American investment bank founded in 1850. Back then, the company profited from the Southern cotton trade, which relied on enslaved labor. Mayer Lehman, one of the founding brothers, personally owned at least 7 slaves. The Lehman Brothers began accepting raw cotton from plantations as payment for goods, later turning it into a major trading business and directly financing plantation operations. A 2003 statement confirmed that the 3 founding brothers owned slaves. The bank's historical ties to slavery sparked criticism for lack of transparency. Although Lehman collapsed in 2008, some of its assets were later acquired by British bank Barclays and Japanese bank Nomura. New York Life, today the largest mutual life insurance company in the US, was founded in 1845 as Nautilus Mutual Life and directly profited from slavery in its early years. Between 1846 and 48, the company wrote at least 485 life insurance policies on enslaved men, women, and children, with payouts going to slaveholders if the enslaved person died. This practice ended by the late 1840s. The company later acknowledged its history, describing it as a stain and pledging to support the black community. Other insurers of the era, including Aetna and US Life, engaged in similar practices. CSX Corporation, a US rail and real estate giant formed in 1980, traces its lineage to railroads built in the 1830s and 40s, including the Western and Atlantic Railroad and the South Carolina Canal and Railroad Company. These railroads used enslaved people to lay track, build tunnels, and perform other grueling construction. Rail lines were also central to the slave economy, transporting goods and enslaved people to markets and ports. In the early 2000s, and again in 2020, lawsuits and shareholder proposals claimed CSX profited from infrastructure built with slave labor. CSX rejected these claims, arguing the company itself did not exist at the time. The New York Times is an American daily newspaper established in 1851. Back then, it published advertisements for the sale of enslaved people. These ads, placed by slave traders and plantation owners, were common in both northern and southern newspapers and provided a notable source of revenue for the paper at that time. The Times acknowledged this history in 2019. Wells Fargo, a major American financial services company founded in 1852, inherited ties to slavery through its 2008 acquisition of the company Wachovia. During a 2005 review of its history, Wachovia admitted that two of its predecessor banks, the Bank of Charleston and the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company, were directly involved in slavery. The Bank of Charleston accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans, while the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company not only engaged in the same practice but also owned at least 162 enslaved individuals. Its railroad division directly exploited enslaved labor to build tracks and infrastructure. In total, at least 529 enslaved people were used by these institutions. Wachovia issued a formal public apology acknowledging these connections. Wells Fargo carries this legacy.